introduce Neil Dixon to you tonight. Neil has been using cameras for most of his life. His passion began while he was on an archaeological field trip school in China, when he discovered that his borrowed camera had no batteries and no light meter, and he needed to learn the basics of photography fast. After studying photography in college alongside with archaeology, Neil started a business blending the two and began a 17-year career in cultural preservation photography. He has worked with conservationists, archivists, and archaeologists, finding imaging solutions to document the past and the present to preserve history for the future. He has now brought his skills as digital photographer to Historic New England, and we are absolutely delighted that he has done so. And recently, Neil was a key player in the creation of Historic New England's 6 new online visitor experiences, which tell the stories of 5 of our historic properties and 2 neighborhoods in Vermont. Through Neil's experience with 3D imaging and panoramic photography, he has greatly enhanced our ability to share these sites with the public. And now, Neil, we look forward to your insights, and here you go.
Thank you very much, Lorna. I will now there we go. Share the screen. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for supporting Historic New England. I'm going to be talking about how to take better pictures and make them last. The world of photography has changed significantly, and I probably don't need to tell any of you that. We have changed drastically from where photography began to what we do today. And if my one goal at all tonight, it is to get you to all think about photography more than you probably do. We have grown to have a camera in our pocket all of the time, and it is one of those things that, when used well, can actually help us document what we are living through today, and if saved properly, will be part of the record of the past in the future. So I'm going to briefly talk about photography as documentation, and we're going to talk about ultimately painting, because painting was the first process. If you wanted your portrait, it was in paint, and now things have changed. Very few portraits get painted. Mostly we have photographs. This is a photograph from the turn of the century. This is from my own personal collection of glass plate negatives. This is from West Windsor, Vermont, and it is one of my absolute favorites. It's the wife of a store owner, 9.5 fingers, a rifle, and a bird. Sort of a fantastic snapshot in time. I think it's fantastic for many reasons. She is amazing, but then it also captures the furniture and all the details, the hardware on the door. It has become progress. We've made it glass plate negatives into instant pictures. This, ironically, is something recently photographed, Polaroid. Polaroid does still exist. It did come back. If any of you enjoyed Polaroid, you can find it again. This brings us to the modern age, though, because from the instant picture, it became the very instant picture, captured digitally. So photography in its beginning was a novelty. It was something that hadn't existed. You could capture a moment in time, and you could go out and document everyday life as it existed. That is something that we've sort of lost sight of because of the ubiquitous nature of photography. We're bombarded in it, in advertising constantly, on our phones, on the internet. Most print media has sort of fallen away. So we don't see the value of the photograph the same as we once did. In the past, people would go out and document their everyday life. This is an image from the Historic New England collection. This is right at the end of my street, actually. It's Mass Ave in Arlington. And as you see, there are trolley tracks. That is the most significant change that I noticed instantly. This is the exact same location today. So if you look back and forth at the two images, you'll notice the architecture has not significantly changed. Some of the buildings have gone, new ones have been built. The trolley is gone. But overall, the architecture stays the same, but the record of how we live and how we interface in the environment is definitely noticeably different between the two. I wanted to also share some work from the NEH grant. This is a photograph by Harry Weir Casey. As I was saying, things have changed. And in some cases, photography documents not necessarily the change, but the stability of the environment. This was photographed in the late 1800s, and this was photographed last fall for the NEH Cares grant that was part of the process of getting all of these beautiful sites online and getting people accessibility to them. As you can see, the structure has changed very little. There were farmers in the late 1800s. There are farmers today. So photography can document both the past and the present for the future, but also sometimes it shows us that things don't shift as much as we might imagine. You can see some structural changes to the barn, but otherwise it's about the same. So really what I'm here to do tonight is to help you think about the camera in your pocket, the iPhone, the Android device, whatever phone you have is an amazing tool for capturing images like this, to document your surroundings. They don't seem very pertinent right now. You might look at it, it's mundane, it's what you walk by every single day. But just in my lifetime, I have seen significant changes, as I'm sure you all have. And sometimes it's only after the fact we think about how much change has taken place. So I'm going to set about trying to show you how to use your camera in your phone a little bit better, and so that you have a better understanding of the process and a better thoughtfulness when it comes to using it, because it's very easy to take it out, just snap a picture, but it isn't necessarily the best picture. And if we're trying to store things for future, the best is always the best. Traditionally in photography, there were 3 tools in the camera that you had adjustment over. One was the shutter speed, one was the aperture or the pupil in the lens itself, and one was the film speed you chose. Things have changed. We don't really have the control over the film speed in a digital camera phone. We do in digital cameras, but in a phone, it's going to make a lot of automatic adjustments. Phones do that. You're not going to have control over your shutter speed or your aperture. There are ways to get around that a little bit. If you force the flash on, it will tend to adjust the shutter speed to be faster. You can make compensations, but it becomes a long process and very actual phone specific to determine exactly how to try to get the most out of it. What we're left with is the controls that we have in the phone. And I believe most people don't really look at what they can do with their camera phone. It becomes something that you pull out of your pocket, you point, you push the button, and you capture the image. Don't think much more about it, and I'm as guilty as the next person. Most of the time, you store them on the phone, you don't think about them. Sometimes you break your phone, sometimes you upgrade your phone, and then you're like, where did that picture go? So at the tail end, we're going to talk about how to maybe help that from happening. So the first thing I want to talk about is composition. I had worked in a camera store years ago when the digital revolution started. I decided the best way to get some practical experience was to get into a camera store, work there, get my hands on everything, go to the trade shows. And what I noticed happen when we stopped selling film cameras and people were only buying digital cameras was that they no longer had 24 or 36 exposures to work with. They had an unlimited number, seemingly, They could buy a bigger memory card and they could just shoot and shoot and shoot. And what I started to call this was zombie photography, because much like zombies in the classic movies, they don't seem to have any purpose or any direction, and they just kind of do what they're doing or once did. So people would go and begin to just take pictures and pictures and pictures just because they could, and they wouldn't think about it. And I saw a shift over about a 2-year period where people didn't focus on what they were photographing because they could do it so quickly and easily, and there was no cost. That was probably the biggest driver. Film, no need to develop, no need to purchase the film. And so with that lowered cost came more motivation to shoot more, but think less about what you were doing. So we're going to talk tonight, beginning with composition, which, as I believe it's been attributed to Ansel Adams, and I'm sure somebody can enlighten me farther. He once said, zoom with your feet. Zoom lenses, when they came out, allowed us to change the aspect of the picture, but a good traditional prime lens required you move closer or farther away. So, as our first example, this is the streets of Haverhill, and this is a building just down the road. I think just about everything you're going to see here has been shot on an iPhone this evening. This is a perfectly fine street shot showing the building behind, the Ellis factory. However, if we move just 10 paces past this lamppost to the other side of the car, we get a completely different feel to the image. And it didn't take much because it really was just 10 steps, but the entire streetscape and the building and the feel of the structure has come to life. When you're talking about composition, there are many different ways to think about it, converging lines. One of the primary tools that I like to use is the rule of thirds. This is a fine example of the rule of thirds. You've probably seen this picture. This is what was on the announcement for this evening's presentation. And if you look, the image has been divided into 3 columns and 3 rows. The best way to focus on taking a photograph is to break up the image this way as you're looking at it, and to think about how you can put portions of your photograph into each one of these blocks. You try to avoid having big empty voids in space. And if you can think a little bit about that, it will help you think about how you're arranging your composition and putting it together, and then help create a better image in the tail end. One trick I also learned from a friend of mine years ago, he pointed out that people have a tendency to read left to right and top to bottom. So very often, if you can put something in the bottom right portion of your composition, here where my back is located, you very often will keep people's eye in the photograph longer. It kind of creates a block preventing them from slipping away from the photograph. Going back to zoom with your feet, I have 2 images I want to share with you. This is a mural down the street here in Haverhill as well, showing shoe manufacturing. But what I want to try to show here is most camera phones have a zoom feature. It is a digital zoom. And so many people might not know exactly how it works. You just kind of pinch your fingers on the screen and the image will zoom in closer. Digital zoom is not at all useful. Digital zoom tends to completely destroy the image. It's better to shoot a wider angle image and then crop what you want, because the digital zoom starts to make pixel interpolation and it falls apart very rapidly. So this image I shot standing in front of the building. This one I backed up and zoomed in with the camera to create a similar composition. It is straighter, more aligned, less keystoning of the building. If you notice, the building is a straight line up the shot. But if we compare the 2 images at 100% resolution side by side, you'll see the one on the left, which represents the first shot with no digital zoom, compared to the one on the right, which is with digital zoom. The one on the left is much sharper. Digital zoom will start to create many pixel artifacts associated with JPEG images, compressed images. and it does not retain much detail. So when at all possible, use your feet. Don't use the zoom feature in your camera. Maybe if you've got some of the newer cameras, the iPhone has multiple lenses now that have telephoto, wide angle, that's acceptable. But if you have just one camera on your phone, do not zoom. It will destroy the image and it will not come out looking very good. So the next consideration we want to think about is lighting. Lighting is really the most important thing about photography. It is the foundation of all photography, because if we don't have any light, we don't have any photo. You should think about how the light falls on your subject. We're going to show you some of these examples. But it is the most important thing, more important than composition even, because it is what's going to make a good photograph versus a mediocre photograph. So, as I've said, watch the sun, but don't look at it. The same goes for your camera. This is a quick example of the building here in Haverhill. And if you notice, I have chose exactly the wrong angle with which to photograph the building. So there is no light falling on the building, some reflection from another building, but that is all. And we're backlit. Once you backlight a lens, what happens is a lot of the light begins to bounce around within the elements of the lens, the glass elements of the lens, and it creates stray light that will reduce the contrast of the image. As you can see here, if we take a few steps to the left and put that sun behind the building, all of that haze disappears. So think about how you're positioning what you have in your shot. Again, composition, keep bright lights and things like that away from the front of the lens so that you're not having any light shining directly in. So this brings us to how do you control light, because you can make the sensible choice to not have a backlit image. And in this case, we have light from behind. We have nice front lighting on the structures. And if you look, we have a box in the center. Very often, and this is not to say everyone hasn't found this, but very often people don't notice that you can tap the screen. I know this to be true for iPhones. I have not specifically used Android. I'm an Apple snob, I hate to admit. However, if you tap the screen, it will do two things. It will create a point of focus wherever you have tapped. So if you're trying to focus on a very specific spot, tap it, and the camera will focus on that spot. But also, as you see here, what appears to the right of our new focused area is a picture of a sun. That can be manipulated. So once you've tapped, you can drag your finger up or drag your finger down to control the exposure. If we drag up, the exposure comes up. And if we drag down, the exposure comes down. So you have a lot of leeway in how your camera behaves. If you just take it out and shoot, you're not going to get a lot of adjustment. If you're too bright, and this is where this is one of the most important rules, if you're too bright in the world of digital imaging, anything that has turned white will never have detail available to it. You can usually find a little detail in shadows, but once you've gone pure white, you have nothing left in the image, and you won't be able to do anything to salvage it in post-production or editing or anything like that. So avoid pure white if you can at all. And in this case, if you look, the snow has got a lot of whites. There's some reflection on the top of the building, the top of the elevator housing. That's okay. But when you get into something that blows out and you lose the detail and definition, then you've lost the photograph. This is an example of what it should look like, well exposed. We don't have any blowouts anywhere. And if you look, we've got detail in all of our shadows, and we've got a good dynamic range within the photograph. Dynamic range being the range between highlights and shadows, bright and dark. So once you take a decent photograph, adjust for the lighting, adjust your composition. There is a lot more editing than people know about in cameras, or that most people explore. And for this, we're going to use an image I took At Hamilton House, while I was doing some video work for the NEH grant. This is the view out the back of Hamilton House. And this is an adjusted image. So as shot and edited. When I edited, I didn't do a lot, but what I did do is I brightened up the shadows and I adjusted it so the light just has a little bit more life to it. Very often digital photographs have what I usually refer to as a gray film over them. And going in and trying to eliminate that gray film with some adjustments makes a much better photograph. So let's quickly scroll through some of the editing capabilities. We're going to use an iPhone, for example, because it is what I know. This is, if you have an Apple, the primary image. Well, it's my photos. And so as you see, it shows and displays your images. In the top right, you'll notice it says edit. Don't be shy. Most people that I know, at least, do not tend to try to edit their photographs, but you can get a lot of things improved by playing around in here. And this is really just a quick example to show you what's there and to motivate you to go and hunt around inside your own camera to see what you can find and what you can do. So once we hit edit, it brings up the adjustment panel. And you can adjust many, many things. There's an auto adjustment. I tend to avoid it. It makes algorithmically based choices to kind of compensate for full blacks. If you're not fully black or you got too much white, it'll try to adjust things. But you can do a lot more if you try to use the tools that they give you. So in the first case, we've got exposure. Exposure is going to brighten and darken the image. This is full exposure. That is full underexposure. This tool, if you've got pure whites, will blow them out very quickly, as you can see in the sun here in the top right. It can be used if you're a little bit overly bright. You can pull back your highlights. Usually I do very minimal exposure tweaking. The exposure is something that's very, what I'll refer to as lossy. This is all JPEG photography. So in terms of photography, the image capture capabilities are usually RAW files and JPEG files. A RAW file, which I'll cover at the very end of this, a RAW file has all of the information and it's an unfinished picture. It's like a negative. And a JPEG file is a finished picture that has been processed through the computer. Most camera phones are going to capture a JPEG. There are some apps that you can use that will allow you to capture RAW. But what you're doing is you're making the decisions here that are going to affect how the final JPEG is processed. So it's kind of like a little bit of RAW adjustment in the camera. Because of that, I don't typically blow out the highlights, but I'll tweak them and tune them a little bit. What I will play with is the brilliance. Brilliance here at full value versus minimal value. And you can see how the details in the shadows come out. This tool is fantastic for pulling out some shadow detail where you're trying to get it, which very often blocks up. Your highlights will adjust only your bright areas. Your sky, typically, as you see here, with full minus and full plus, bring a little color and life into the sky. Your shadows, again, will only adjust the darker areas of your image. So you can adjust to darken or brighten as you need to see fit. Sometimes I'll adjust the shadows up to make them brighter. And then I will use the contrast, which is full contrast and minimal contrast. I'll bring the contrast down a little bit. And then play with brightness and the next one, which is black point, to adjust and find that perfect area where you've got just the right amount of detail. This is, again, black point. It darkens the blacks, the very back of that shadow area. And as you can see, if you pull it all the way up, it brightens up just the shadowy areas. You're also probably able to see that you really ruin photographs using this. So it's very minor adjustments and minor tweaks is best. Again, saturation, full desaturation, which is producing a black and white image. Vibrance, which, unlike saturation, it's a similar tool. However, it tends to give you more control over the intensity of the color as opposed to the absolute plus or minus value of the color. Warmth can be adjusted to either a warmer amber or a bluer, and tint to a magenta or green. Both the warmth setting and the tint setting are in traditional raw photographic processing, your white balance adjustments. So if you need to compensate for the color of the light, as you're looking at me here, you can see that there is a warm light falling on me. This is a tungsten light, and the other lights in here are fluorescents, which are producing a more green tone. So if you need to adjust for a specific color, if you've got too much of this green light from the fluorescence, you can use your tint to warm it up with a little bit of magenta and change the white balance and tone of the image. Once we get down farther, we're into sharpness. Don't touch any of these tools. If you don't see that the slider goes in two directions, I recommend avoiding it. Definition, same sort of thing. These are going to be a more heavily processed look in the image. And if what we're doing here, what I'd like you to do is think about preservation in terms of imaging and documenting your surroundings with the tool in your pocket. Minimal processing is always going to be better. Noise reduction, again, try to shoot with better light so you don't need to worry about any noise. Noise is going to act like film grain. So if you are used to shooting film, shooting a 3200 speed film is going to produce a very grainy image as opposed to 100 speed. 100 speed is going to be a very fine grained image, look much cleaner. So more light, less need for noise reduction. And then vignetting, which can be kind of fun because it will bring the eye into the image or sort of blow out the edges. You can also use the markup tool to add captions. And because you're capturing on a phone and because you're capturing something that is probably going to be less capable of having metadata added to it later, sometimes if you've got a very specific image that's important, tagging it with what it is and when it is would be a good idea. So in this case, the phone will give you the option to use tools to add information. In this case, I'm going to add a text box. And I position my text box and I place Hamilton House 11/20/20 so that I know where I was and when I was in terms of what I captured. And there is what I think is actually a slightly over-processed image, but a demonstration of what you can do. So to sum it up, you want to make sure that you're looking at your subject and you're thinking about your subject. And then you want to change your angle. Don't stay in one position. As an anecdotal story, I was in Tubac, Arizona. It's a little artist town down near the Mexican border. And I had a Hasselblad camera with me. And when I started photography, really making a lot of photographs, I was a very wide angle lens kind of person. Loved that big, expansive view. And I came across a building, and I knew I wanted to take a picture of the building, but I couldn't quite identify why. And I realized after looking at it through a wide angle lens that I didn't see what I was trying to see. And I progressively changed out lenses until I got to a telephoto lens. And while looking through the Hasselblad, I realized that what has stopped me is not the building. It is a very small portion of the back that had a pepper wreath and an old weathered chair and some trellis work, and it was unchanged for 100 years, this little back portion of the building, but it was just an 8-foot section. And I had stopped because I had seen it. My mind knew there was something there, but it took me a process of narrowing and editing the photograph in the lenses before I realized that looking at your composition and thinking about your composition and editing your composition down to what's most important and what stopped you and really caught your eye is a really key critical component of taking good pictures. So don't just pull out the camera, go to take the picture, stop and think about what you're looking at and then explore it. Look at it maybe with different angles, different intensities of distance, wide angle, more telephoto, or up closer. So also think about the lighting and Good architectural photography usually is not done on a whim. There is definite thought process in terms of where is the light, what are the angles, what's the intensity, what are the shadows it's creating, how does it show the surface texture of the building or anything that you happen to be photographing. Direct, harsh light on people sometimes is bad. Strange shadows across noses, not great. So think about what is the light, and don't be in a rush to take a picture. Come back if you have to. Think about when it's going to be maybe in shade if it needs to be, or when it's going to be lit. Also, remember that from a documentary standpoint, once you've taken these pictures, don't overprocess them. And a lot of camera phones have digital filters. I think Instagram is one of those things. I have to admit, I am a photographer who's not on Instagram, which might make me the only one. My mother is on Instagram, and at 82, she puts me to shame. But there's a lot of filter use that you can use. Try to capture as accurate an image as possible that locks that period of time in place so that you've got a record that you can go back to or others will go back to. People often ask me, where can you see my photos? And most of the time, up until my time with Historic New England, I tell them in dark storage somewhere in a government facility, because I don't shoot images for today, I shoot images for tomorrow to be archived and used later by others when they're trying to do things like conditions assessment. And if you are interested in using your camera phone more, there are tools. I have access to a lot of cameras. I do not use these tools on my phone, but I do have good friends that use them to great success. There are photo apps. If you start exploring the possible purchases that will allow you to unlock things in your camera like raw image processing that will not just capture a JPEG or a compressed finished image, but will give you the ability to manipulate and edit. That raw file can be downloaded, and then you can use a tool like Photoshop to make improvements. And raw data in the photo is always going to be more controllable. You're going to have more ability to make it brighter, darker, keep detail where normally detail would be lost. So one of the most important steps you can do when you start thinking about using your phone, if you're going to use your phone to document the world, you need to pay attention to what it's set up for. I'm going to show you an example that's an iPhone. Sure, there's an equal in an Android, but image formats typically for phones are compressed. That Polaroid earlier I showed you of my friends, that was shot and sent to me. And the file on my phone, looked like a regular old picture taken on a phone, but it was a proprietary Apple format that is designed for maximum efficiency. Efficiency means data loss in terms of digital imaging. And so setting up your camera to be as best you can is the right choice. In terms of an Apple, in the general settings menu, you will find a title for camera. And hunt for this, it is absolutely going to be something you should adjust. The first thing you find is formats. And under formats, you will find this simple choice: high efficiency or most compatible. High efficiency is going to record in HEIF or HEVC for still pictures and video. Or if you go to most compatible, it will do JPEG files, JPEG being a standard compressed image file. It's been around for years and years. And it's very readable. It should be very readable in the future. There are better choices in terms of what you can save them out as later. But most compatible is going to be the choice you're going to want. If you are given other options, JPEG or TIFF or RAW files would be great as well. Again, there's so many phones, I don't know all of them, unfortunately. So importing your photos. You've taken images, you've made your phone work right, you've shot the images, you need to import them. This is a hazier gray area. However, let me help you try to navigate. So you want to look for the phone app in either Apple or Microsoft. Even to this day, I get confused when trying to move pictures off the phone. It does take a little time. I have some experience, but it won't be an immediate obvious thing. The tool that you're looking for is going to be your photo app. Microsoft has one in the Windows operating system. Apple has one. And it's going to be the device that helps interface the camera and the phone with the computer and bring those images into some form of lightweight digital asset management. So both major operating systems are going to have the phone app. You're going to look for that, or the Photos app. Windows is going to be the easiest. I actually, when downloading my iPhone pictures, will always do it on a Windows machine, because when you take the charging cable, in my case, a lightning cable, it has a standard USB end. Plug the USB end into the computer, plug the lightning port into the phone, and it will connect. There is going to be a part where the computer is going to ask for you to make sure that the phone is on and that the phone is agreeing that they're both safe to communicate. But once you've agreed on the computer and on the phone will load as a disk drive. So in your Finder window, you will see the phone appear as a disk drive, and when you click on it, it will give you full access to all of the images on the phone that you can then view, selectively drag and drop onto the desktop into another folder or put wherever you like. So always remember, you're going to have to jump between the computer and the phone to make sure that they are agreeing with each other and that there is communication. It's a security feature that prevents people from being able to plug in a phone and just download information. There has to be agreement between the two devices. Apple, not so much. Apple definitely requires the photo app. Anytime I've used my Apple phone on my Apple computers, I'm forced to use the phone or the photo app to download those images and retrieve them. The photo apps are basically limited capability digital asset management. They'll organize it by date. You can do some adjustments within it. And I definitely promote that you explore that. If you've got metadata adjustment capabilities, you can go back to the photographs and you can add in any information you have, because a photograph, a digital photograph specifically, is only as good as the information that's with it. Otherwise, like the shoeboxes upon shoeboxes of family photos I have now that everyone's dead, they're meaningless. I can't tell who people are. So digital files, digital image files, have the ability to store information in them. And by doing that, you'll make that picture more valuable in the future. So if you're looking for more information, I've got 2 Google search options. Use importing photos from a phone, and you should find the Apple instructions immediately. Again, here is the address to the Apple support, instructing you on how to do it. And downloading photos from a phone in Google, the search app, will give you the Microsoft option, and it will walk you through step by step how to get your photos from your phone into the computer and then have them stored. So again, I am Neil Dixon. If you have any further questions, don't hesitate, shoot me an email. I am happy to answer questions about photography. I could talk for hours about it. It bores most people. But my email is ndixon@historicnewengland.org. And I'm going to open it up for questions. So feel free.
Okay. Hi, so I'm going to, it's Lorna again.
Lorna.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes.
I can hear you.
Okay, so I have a number of questions, and I'm going to ask you the first question. How did you deal with that situation in China? Tell us.
It was very fortuitous. I borrowed a camera. It was an Iconis 5, an underwater Nikon camera that was able to operate in a single shutter speed mechanically at, I believe it was 1/60th of a second. And I had manual aperture controls on the lens, so I could adjust the pupil, and I just had one shutter speed. My friend had left the instruction manual in the bag. So though I found myself halfway around the world, I had everything I needed to get a crash course in what to understand about light exposure. And it was one of those sort of, what is it, sunny 16 is one of the old photographer's rules. As long as it's a good sunny day, set it to f16. and I believe it was 1/60th of a second, maybe 1/25th, and you'd be good to go, and all your exposures would be right. And so I sort of followed that rule. The downside was I had slide film, which is much less forgiving, and so I have half of what I should have had. But through frustration comes learning and experience. So.
Great, thank you. So next question, what should I look for in a camera phone?
That is a good question, because one of the aspects of digital photography is that we're not using film, we're using a digital imaging sensor. And the digital imaging sensor, each pixel within that imaging sensor is got a size. And all of these camera phone chips are very small, just minuscule. And the bigger the pixel size, the more light receptive it's going to be. So obviously it'll have more surface area, it'll be able to gather light quicker and more efficiently, which will make less noisy, grainy images. If you're trying to get a camera phone, I am always excited by the idea of bigger megapixel, 50 megapixel. I've seen, I think, even more now. However, I tend to believe that something in that 12 megapixel category, much like what Apple seems to be doing, and I know a lot of the Android phones, that tends to be a really happy medium where your pixel is receptive enough to light that your pictures still come out looking pretty good, and that you don't have too much noise. That being said, as some of my examples showed, if you've got more resolution, you can crop more and not need to zoom. But I tend to find somewhere in the 12 megapixels is good. 12 megapixels is also fairly comparable with 35 millimeter film of the past. So it's
Great,
like having an old camera, just much newer.
Okay, the person asks, I have slide photos from the 50s. I want to have these images printed. Where can I have this done?
Ooh, that is a good question. You are going to need to have them scanned. They are obviously traditional film, and most people do not do color printing traditionally on silver halide paper. So it's going to be a digital reproduction, digital print. But you're going to need to find a person or an organization that can do scanning. I would recommend probably sending me an email, and I can make a recommendation of multiple possible choices. There's a number that are coming to mind, but I'd have to double check and make sure that they do slide scanning. It's a functional capable choice. But again, my email, which should be here, and I believe it's going to be put into the follow-up email that comes out to everyone who signed up tonight. Feel free, shoot me an email and I can make recommendations.
Great. Next question. I want to photograph a farmhouse that is white. Any tips for the best time of day to do that? Yes.
So a white farmhouse is going to be tricky because, as I said earlier, if you overexpose, everything is lost. You're not going to have detail. So there's a couple choices. You could use, if you're using a camera phone, I assume we're talking about camera phone, tap the screen, see if you can adjust the exposure down. But if you don't have a lot of functional capability, one of the best ways to do it is to make the choice that in lighting, we use soft boxes. That's actually what's right behind me here and what's illuminating me on this side. They soften the light. Nature gave us a wonderful softbox. It's called a cloud. And so if you go out on a day in which you've got clouds, you can just wait until a cloud passes over the sun, or even an overcast day, and you'll be able to get a lot more detail out of the shot. It won't be quite as dramatic, but it will allow you to capture all the detail you're looking for.
Okay. Next question. How do I get photos from an Android onto a MacBook?
So that is my nemesis. In that I don't have an Android, I do have a MacBook. My guess is you're going to have to use the photo app that comes on the MacBook. It should be available, and I believe it should be downloadable for free. I've had to do this in the past, and I believe the link I put up talks about this, saying specifically Apple support information will tell you that you need to use your USB cable and then the Photos app to be able to go in and download the images into the hard drive of the computer.
Great. Next question. I wasn't clear on how you can make a text box on your photo.
So it's going to be in the image editing capability. So most phones will have the camera and they'll have the photos. So when you're going through and looking at your photos, when you're looking at an image, there should be somewhere on the screen a button that will say edit and give you the ability to make adjustments. In the case of Apple, it's not as easily found. In an Apple phone specifically, it'll be 3 dots, I believe, in the top right. But when you click on that, it will give you options. And in this case, that option is referred to as markup. And markup will allow you to draw on the picture. It'll allow you to add a text box. One of the things I can say in having played with multiple phones over the years, don't be afraid to push a button. Your phone is just a computer, and as I think we've all learned, when the computer breaks, shut it off, turn it on, and it generally is fine. So push buttons and check. But again, there'll be something specifically in Apple called markup that will allow you to add a text box. You can change the color of the font, move it around, put it wherever.
Great. What about emailing photos from your phone to your computer? Emailing photos.
That is something I've done many, many times. It is slower, and if you have a phone full of pictures, I would tell you it's probably not the right choice. If you are taking pictures with the phone, you want the maximum resolution you can get. So what I will usually do is download them via the cable, because if you send over a number of pictures, and in fact, I did that for this presentation, I had emailed myself a number of pictures. Some of my images, some of the folders of images that I chose were 40, 50, 60 megabytes of picture files, which don't transfer well through email. In the case of Apple, they allow you to mail drop. Apple's nice little service, if you use their mail provider, that will send the person a link to a website where they can download it. But generally, if you can use a cable, it's going to be a better deal. If you're doing 1, 2, 3 images, yeah, email's fine. But if you're trying to get a lot of them off there and clean the phone and organize, then definitely cable is the better choice.
Okay. For long-term metadata storage, do you recommend storing info in the EXIF in the files, or keep in some separate file, like a plain text file, for maximum compatibility?
In the long term, maximum compatibility is best. So very often what I'll do in my own situation is I'll use an XMP sidecar, which is just a separate metadata file. But you do have to remember that if you're doing that, you need to make sure you migrate images and metadata, otherwise you lose things. So in some cases, it depends on what you're doing, but I would tend to make sure that maximum compatibility is always the choice. Very often a photo isn't very useful now, but it is in the future. So doing whatever you can to make sure that it is going to be there and readable, specifically in the age of constantly changing digital technology, that would be the choice I'd make.
Great, thanks. How do you know how much to adjust a photo? Are there standard guidelines, or is it just personal preference?
It's personal preference. It depends on the use. For instance, the image I showed you at the back of my camera at Hamilton House, I overdid that specifically because it was just prettier. But when I shoot for informational purposes, if I'm shooting something that is a structure, which I do often, I try to do as little editing as possible. My primary goal, I take bad pictures, that's what I say. But I take bad pictures because I try to get all of the detail in as much as humanly possible. So good punchy images with high contrast look great, but they tend to have less information because you've pushed the image into a very visually appealing place, but it might not have all of the detail that becomes very useful information later and down the line. So it's personal preference, and it's, again, images.
Great. Do you have suggestions on how to store images once they're on the computer? Cloud storage versus physical storage? Are there pros and cons to each?
Aha, I love this question. This has been my personal nightmare for like 5 years. I hated cloud storage just because I'm a control freak, I think, maybe. But I learned to embrace it because it provides another aspect of data storage. My own personal preference is internal storage. I always liked discs, so CDs or DVDs that were archival, gold reflective layers that wouldn't deteriorate, very solid dyes. There was a company that had come out with a product called M-Disc, which used instead of a dye layer, it was an inorganic compound, much like rock, that had proved under, oh gosh, it was a government white paper, but it had proved to be about 1,000 years stable. But what we've seen recently is that disk drives, DVD drives, are becoming a thing of the past, and finding disks is almost impossible, which has made me start to realize that if you can burn it to a disk, it is as tangible as a digital file gets. It's a recording of ones and zeros that will make up that image. If it can be kept safely and stored properly, it will provide a backup. Recording them onto a magnetic disk, like your hard drive, another good choice. Probably both would be best. And then if you can put them in the cloud, in a cloud storage. I have a good friend of mine who uses Amazon Web Services cloud storage. It's very cheap. They're not readily accessible. You can't access them. But once you've uploaded them, you can request them back. And it becomes a very reasonable way to have a backup redundant storage solution that, irregardless of act of God or whatnot, will keep those images for you in the future.
Great. So any opinions to share about using HDR when photographing with camera phones?
Yes. HDR is great. HDR is a fun trick. HDR, for those who don't know, is high dynamic range imaging. And it is ultimately taking 3 images, one or more, as many as you want, really. But it's taking an underexposed, an overexposed, and a good exposure, so that you're shooting really for the highlights and the shadows and the mid-range, and then digitally merging those images together to create a dynamic range in the photograph, the difference between black and white, that expands beyond what the technology in the camera can actually do. I tend to use HDR a lot because very often when you're out shooting, you just can't. The technology in the camera can't capture the range from white to black. And HDR will open up that range for you and allow you to capture a well-detailed image that has shadow detail, highlight detail. So yeah, I definitely would say, if you can use HDR, go for it. Sometimes HDR tends to get a little too saturated and bright and colorful for my taste. But it's subjective, but it's a great tool.
Great. Here's a question. I've had this problem myself. I have an iPhone 12 Pro. I was at Nubble Light the other day, 5 feet away from a juvenile gull sitting on a gorgeous rock. I took his picture, at which point he flew almost into my head. My iPhone was on live, so when I took the picture, it is a video. When I look at my still photo, it is the bird flying in the upper left corner of my picture. What is the live for? Is it like burst? I would love a picture of the bird. Is it possible from live?
That is a great question, and I should have possibly talked about this because live is my enemy. Because what it does is it tries to shoot a video. It's a really fantastic thing when you're shooting, for instance, my kids, because my kids don't stop moving. So sometimes you get just that little bit of snippet of activity, and it creates a sense of motion in the picture. So shutter speed, those three tools I talked about before, where you had shutter speed, aperture, and film speed, your shutter speed would freeze motion or allow blur, motion blur, to give a sense of motion. Live is kind of a continuation of that idea, where instead of just a blur to give the sense of motion, you're actually capturing a picture with some actual motion to it. However, if you are trying to use your phone for straight photography, shut off live. And again, in that camera settings submenu I talked about, there will be an option to get in there and make an adjustment so your camera doesn't revert back to live, which is how Apple sets the camera usually right out of the box. But it will create what ultimately is a lower resolution movie file as opposed to a picture file. So you do have some loss in the image quality when shooting it live.
Great. So we have time for just a couple of more questions, and I will pass along a helpful comment that the Northeast Document Conservation Center in Andover does do slide scanning if anyone's interested. So here's a question. The phone as a camera is so slow to come online that the subject is often gone by the time I can click it. How to make it ready faster? How do I make it ready faster?
So, and again, I'll talk to my knowledge. The iPhone, when you click the home button just to wake the phone up, if you swipe to the left, it immediately brings up the phone or the camera. And it means you don't have to unlock the phone and then try to find and navigate. Other than that, it does suffer from what back in the olden days of digital photography we referred to as shutter lag. You won't find it in more modern digital SLRs and things, but the phone does still have a certain amount of lag time associated with it. One of the best things you can do is try to prepare for the photograph. Stinks for instantaneous imaging, but if you can think about the photograph ahead of time and get it ready, that tapping the center of the screen will get your focus ready to go, and that will speed up the process of image capture a little bit.
Great. So with all of the different kinds of adjustments possible in the editing feature, is there a guideline about the order in which to make those adjustments to get the best results?
No, there's no specific order. My general rule is that when I look at the image, well, when I take the image, I try to make sure that I shoot for detail in the highlights. So I don't want to lose the sky. I don't want anything to blow out up top. Sometimes when you make adjustments to keep the detail in the highlights, you'll see that the image is blocked up black in the shadows. And that might just mean you need to come back and take it at a better time, adjust your time for lighting. But if you can keep the detail in the highlights, the whites, then utilizing all those adjustments, you can make some adjustments, detune the contrast. Take the contrast down a little bit, and that'll brighten up your shadows that are darker. Go to your shadow setting and brighten that up a little bit. The brilliance, again, I had showed that was the second tool after exposure. The brilliance will brighten up your shadows as well. But ultimately, if you can get the highlights in the image capture, use the editing tool sparingly to just try to bring up those details in the portions of the image that don't have any. Exposure, which I said I don't use very often, is a great way at the very end to just punch those highlights up to get the light to kind of pop in the image.
Thank you. So one last question. We've had some really great questions tonight. Neil, thank you for doing such a great job answering them. If we weren't able to get to your question, you have Neil's email, and I'm sure he'd be happy to respond to you. But our last question for the evening is, I take photos of buildings on Beacon Hill. Most are at least 4 floors, and there isn't enough room to get the whole building in the frame, even if standing on the porch of the building across the street. Any ideas on how to get a photo of the whole building?
A fantastic question. Yes, I have an idea. There is, in most phones nowadays, a panoramic feature that will allow you to move the phone and capture a sweep of an image. I'd love to know the technology behind it. I like to pretend in my mind it's like a little circuit camera, which was Kodak's movable film and slit lens operation. But it will allow you to pan up and capture more detail. There is usually some distortion associated with it because it is creating ultimately a cylindrical panoramic. And so you'll see a little bit of distortions that if you have editing software, you can help remove. That is a fantastic tool. One thing to think about when doing that is that when working in panoramic photography, where you want to turn and pivot the camera is the nodal point of the lens. Ultimately, within the lens, the light comes in, the light from the top crosses, and the light from the bottom crosses, and they create an upside down image in the back of the camera. At that point of crossing within the lens, to simplify the process, if you rotate on that point of where the light crosses, you will minimize the amount of distortion you get, the parallax distortion associated with creating a panoramic. So when you're doing a panoramic with your phone, think to try to pivot where the lens is as opposed to sweeping motions with your arms, and you'll minimize some of that distortion and allow yourself to capture full heights. But again, getting off the ground to midpoint and then sweeping up, yeah, that's the best.
Great. Neil, thank you very, very much for this really enlightening conversation and hugely helpful. I want to thank all of our participants. We're delighted that you joined us this evening. Thanks, Claire. And you have Neil's email, so I want to say good night, and please join other Historic New England programs that are coming up. Good night.
Thank you all very much.
Bye-bye.